If you hear thunder in a snowstorm, run. I'd never heard of a thundersnow until I was in college. When you live in the Midwest, weather can be chaotic, but this particular storm came up quickly, even for us. On Thursday morning, there was a normal snowstorm coming. By Friday morning, they were preparing to shut down the city. Businesses began to announce early closings. Even the mall was closed by 3 p.m. The college I attended even ended classes at noon. A group of friends and I decided to take advantage of the early release by going to a restaurant by the mall for lunch. We were only inside for an hour or so, but by the time we got out, there was easily an additional 6 inches of snow on the ground. On the way home, every time we stopped, my friends would have to get out and push the car until it started going again, including pushing to get the car going so I could manage to drive off after dropping them off. I decided to gamble and stop at the gas station closest to our apartment on the way home. If we were getting snowed and I was going to pick up a pack of cigarettes and some basic supplies. I managed to park under the canopy by the gas pumps where a patch of bare concrete would provide enough traction to get going again. The gas station is a larger chain gas station in the heart of a college business district. It's bars, clubs, pizza places, head shops, and at least one hipster coffee shop. Locals refer to the whole thing as the Hill. My point is that we were at this gas station at least once a day, often 2 or 3 times. The same was true for the hundreds of students who lived within blocks of the area. I wasn't the only one stopping in for supplies. It was filled with people, most of whom had stories similar to mine. I was standing in line holding some frozen pizzas, soda, and chips when I heard the clerk talking to the other customers about the coming storm. The forecast had escalated significantly. Behind the counter, a small TV was playing. The weatherman came on, standing in front of a map of the Midwest that was a giant purple blob that covered our entire state. "Jesus Christ," I said. The clerk reached over and turned up the volume. A hush fell over the people near the counter as everyone listened. Highway Patrol has issued a statement. Do not leave your homes. Do not travel. The interstates and highways had been shut down. Rescuers and snowmobiles were shuttling people trapped in their cars to the nearest rest areas. Plows had been called in for the night. Please, everyone, he said. Stay home. If you don't, you will be on your own. The silence hung heavy and felt ominous, I guess, would be the right word. Well, I guess I better go, said the person at the front of the line, breaking the tension and prompting a few laughs from the growing number of people in line. Well, I'm not going anywhere, said the clerk. I have to work all night anyway. Besides, my apartment is right next door. She gestured toward the window, but instead of the blue apartment buildings we should have been able to see, the window was nothing but solid white. Just then the doors opened and 2 of my roommates ducked in. You guys have the same idea as me? I said, gesturing at my pizzas and snacks. No, AJ said, Blazer's stuck in the bookstore parking lot. I thought the Blazer had 4-wheel drive, I said. It does, chimed in AJ's girlfriend Jenna. She'd shared his room for months, and for the most part, she was pretty cool. Damn, that sucks. Let's get our stuff and I'll drive us home, I said. Even though I'd been in the gas station less than 10 minutes, the small patch of concrete I had carefully parked my back tires on was filled in with 2 inches of snow. The tracks from where I drove in were almost filled with snow. I was glad we didn't have to go far. By car, it was 2 blocks. Most of the time we walked, and from the back door to the gas station it was more like a half a block. Going slow and occasionally getting out to push, we managed to not only get home but get the car in the driveway, as well. My third and final roommate, Trevor, got home just after we did, pulling his tiny car and right behind mine. Making our way into the house, the snow was so deep had to walk in each other's footsteps and try not to fall over along the way. By the time we got inside, we were laughing and happy to be home. In the foyer that we shared with the apartment upstairs, we paused to stomp the snow off our shoes and brush it off our clothes and coats. "Holy shit, it's crazy out there," AJ said, stepping carefully out of his wet shoes onto the dry carpet in the living room. "It's pretty when you look at it from in here," Jenna said, peering out the window at the houses across the street. It was one of the prettier types of snow. The kind with big fat sticky flakes. Still, the uneasy feeling lurked in the back of my mind. We weren't strangers to winter or severe weather, but this was unnerving. The weatherman wasn't even trying to guess how much snow we'd get anymore. He just kept saying it was impossible to predict how much snow we would get. Local news was an endless stream of businesses that had closed early and warnings not to travel. At the hospitals, staff were staying over because the replacement staff couldn't get through. What else was there to do? We did what every college student does when there are 4 people in the same room. We played cards. It was close to 4:03 in the afternoon when there was a knock on our door. One of the guys upstairs poked his head in. We didn't know the guys upstairs real well, but of the 4, he was by far my favorite. His name was Metal, which I had been pretty pleased to find out was his actual last name. He was a bit of a power stoner, but was generally cool to be around. But to be fair, he was also a little bit crazy. "Guys, anyone want to go to the gas station with me?" he asked, in a wide-eyed, excited tone. "Not possible," AJ said, not looking up as he carefully arranged the cards in his hand. "Roads are all fucked. I'm not driving, dude. I'm walking," Metal said as if he had thought of the most innovative weather problem solution of all time. "Anyone want to come with?" "What are you getting?" I asked. "Smokes, certainly. Toilet paper. Beer, probably. Pizza, possibly." I shrugged. "I'm in." I got up and rummaged through my room for my warm coat and gloves. When I came back out of my bedroom, my roommates were holding out cash in my direction. "Hey, would you bring me a pack of smokes?" AJ said first. "And me," Jenna added. "Yeah, me too," said Trevor. "No way. You can come with us and buy your own," I said in a joking voice, but he right well knew I was also serious. "I'll send enough money for 2 and you can have the other one," he offered. The others agreed. "Uno, dos, tres, cuatro, cinco, cinco, seis," Metal sang, doing a strange little dance in the kitchen by the back door. "Good enough," I said, taking their money. Of course, at this time smokes only cost $1.87 a pack. So the payment wasn't as big as it would be today. We frequently made deals like this, especially when the weather was bad. Now, before you chastise me for going out, you need to remember a few things. First, it was only about 7 p.m., so it wasn't overly late. Second, if we walked through our backyard, the gas station was only about half a block away. Finally, we walked this route not only to go get smokes and snacks, but also to get to classes. I personally walked this route in every possible state of mind and influence. This was twice as true as Metal because he'd lived upstairs for twice as long as I had and had done twice as many drugs. It was because of all this that I didn't worry too much about making the trip. It's also why none of my roommates worried too much for us. Honestly, I thought it would be kind of novel. I'd never seen a storm like this, and I was kind of looking forward to checking it out. Nothing about going to the gas station felt unsafe to any of us. Just as we were getting ready to go, an odd yet familiar sound rumbled through the house. My brain couldn't quite register what it was right away because it was so out of place. Was that thunder? Jenna asked. I think so. I heard it too, AJ confirmed. That's crazy, I said. I didn't think much of it at the time. I do remember looking over at the window where Jenna had been marking the rising snow by scratching lines in the frost on the window. They were low on the house, so the fact that we saw snow at window level wasn't alarming, but I was a little surprised to see that the snow was now about an inch above the line she'd drawn not 5 minutes earlier. When you're 20 and in college, well, you're damn near immortal, or at least you think you are, so we finished getting ready and made for the back door. If we're not back in 30 minutes, send the sled dog, Metal said laughing, referring to our landlord's dog Charlie, who was a notoriously aggressive ankle-biting chihuahua. The back steps were a mound of snow, so we just sort of trudged our way blindly through it until we were on the ground level. The snow wasn't too bad. It was up to just above our knees, which required us to lift each leg out of the snow to take each step forward, but it was doable. We paused when we got to the alley at the end of our backyard. The snow had gotten noticeably thicker. I looked up at the security light up over our heads. The light was visible through the snow, but I couldn't make out the details of the fixture at all. Across the alley from us was the chain-link fence that bordered one of the houses we walked between. It would be helpful to hold onto it as we walked through the snow. Only about 1.5 feet of it stuck up out of the drift, but we were able to keep moving. The whole time we walked, Metal chatted away, generously peppering stories and observations with top-shelf profanity as we made our way through the deep snow with the help of the chain-link fence. We were losing visibility, but we could still see individual street lights lining the hill, like glowing orbs in the night. Suddenly the snow around us filled with a barrage of flashing light, followed by the unmistakable sound of a thunderclap. The glow of the streetlight faded away as we were suddenly hit with the weight of a massive amount of snow from out of nowhere. Fucking wind! Metal shouted at the sky as we shook the snow off of our shoulders and hats. It had blown off of something nearby and directly down on top of us. Or at least that's what we thought happened. At that point, why would we have thought it was anything else? One big step at a time, we followed the chain-link fence until we made it to the front yard of the house. From here, all we had to do was cross a small street, walk around the bank, and the gas station would be right across the street. I didn't say anything to Metal, but I was starting to get a little nervous. He didn't seem to notice as he yammered away about all the things he always yammered about. Music. Drugs. Pulp Fiction. Music and drugs. Drugs and music. Drugs and music and Pulp Fiction. All we could do was keep moving and get back as soon as we could. I was kind of regretting the trip, but we were already halfway there. It would be stupid to turn back at this point. From here, I could just make out the overhead glow of the streetlights again just on the other side of the bank. The snow on the street was as deep as the snow by the chain-link fence, but here there would be nothing to hold on to. We'd just have to walk in the direction of the bank. I could tell Metal was starting to feel uneasy too when he got quiet and walked closer to me. I didn't mind. It was getting harder and harder to see, and that was unnerving enough. The thought of being out here alone was more than a little unpleasant. We began to make our way across the small road. Halfway across, the lightning flashed again, followed by a crack of thunder that ushered in another blanket of snow that fell heavily on our heads and shoulders. There was nothing we could do but stand there until it eased off. It took longer for the snow to lighten this time. When the streetlights came back into view, It seemed like they were softer and farther away. We didn't hesitate, just continued moving toward the bank, straining to make out its shape in front of us somewhere. Even though it was dark outside, the snow seemed to have its sort of light. It swirled around with the snowflakes and dazzled your eyes. Almost hypnotic. But if it was as light as it seemed, we have been able to see more than we could. Just as I was pretty sure we were almost at the bank, the wind began to howl. I'd heard the expression before, but I'd never truly understood how real it could be. It was a terrifying scream that seemed right next to me, making me shudder not from the cold, but from a deep, penetrating fear. "What the fuck?" Metal shouted and started pushing harder toward the bank. I had to struggle to keep up with him, but I knew he couldn't go far. The bank didn't have a parking lot. It was a small building with just enough room for one car to drive around to the drive-thru. It served mostly college students who were almost always on foot. Metal was getting farther ahead of me, and I could barely make out his black parka. "Metal!" I shouted, but the words seemed muffled by the snow and swept away by the wind. I kept moving in the direction he had gone, even though I couldn't see his coat anymore. He wanted to get to the bank, and I didn't blame him. I knew I felt a whole lot better when I was touching that wall, too. Another flash of lightning and another shriek. This time it sounded like it was right in front of me. I cried out in fear. The thunderclap hit, and the snow that followed knocked me off my feet. I came up sputtering, trying to clear the snow from my mouth and nose. "Metal!" I shouted again, and this time I thought I heard him reply from up ahead of me. I kept moving in the direction of the bank, and after a dozen or so trudging steps, I was blindsided by an arm that darted out of the swirling white wasteland, grabbed my shoulder, and yanked me hard in their direction. It was Metal. He was standing with his back against the wall of the bank. If he hadn't grabbed me, I'd have probably kept walking. Who knows what would have happened if I'd missed the bank? It wasn't easy navigating around it. On the back side where we were, the snow had blown up against the wall, so it was deeper and harder to walk through, but neither of us wanted to leave the reassurance of the wall, even though the snow was harder to get through. I tried to shout to Metal that we needed to head for the foyer with the ATM, but I don't know if he heard me. The snow was quiet, but also took the words out of your mouth as soon as you said them. It was just like talking underwater. Muffled and dull. Metal had the same idea as me though. On the other side of the bank, there was a 24-hour ATM that was located inside a small glass foyer that was always unlocked. We could stop there and get out of the snow for a while. By this point, we were fighting for forward momentum. It had been a bad idea to try to walk to the gas station, and I regretted it with every step. God, it was great when my gloved fingers found the front corner of the bank building. I was way beyond wanting to be home or at the gas station. All I wanted was to be inside and not in this storm. I'd have climbed in a doghouse if we'd come across one. The door to the foyer was covered in snow. Metal and I had to spend 5 minutes kicking the snow out of the way before we could get the door to open enough for us to squeeze through, but inside felt like a paradise. I didn't realize how all of that snow around my face had made me feel like I was suffocating. I ripped my scarf off and opened my coat so I could breathe again. I was so preoccupied with that, it took me a minute to notice Metal was frozen in place, staring into the corner of the little foyer. "What is it?" I asked, my eyes following his gaze. "I thought I saw something," he said, in a puzzled voice. The snow in the corner swirled in and out. But for a second, I did see something. I think I did. Something like a face, but gray skin, gray eyes. "Do you mean snow-colored?" It was not a stretch to see things in the swirling snow, especially after straining to see in the storm. Metal shrugged and began foraging inside his coat, pulling out a pack of smokes and a lighter. He pulled out a cigarette and then offered me the pack. I took one. "We probably shouldn't smoke in here," I said. "Extraordinary circumstances call for extraordinary measures," he replied, lighting his cigarette and sitting down in the middle of the room. He was quieter and more serious than I had ever seen him. When he finally made eye contact, I could see that he wasn't just serious, he was scared. I'm sure he saw the same look on my face, too. The bank foyer wasn't warm, but it wasn't nearly as cold as it was outside. I took off my gloves so I could smoke less awkwardly. We smoked that first cigarette in silence. As soon as I stubbed out the first one, I fished out my pack and offered one to Metal, which he took. He lit it carefully and then said in a quiet voice, "What are we gonna do, man?" I shrugged. "We could keep going," I said. "We could go back or we could stay here. That about sums up our choices. If we keep going, we're staying at the gas station until tomorrow," he said, lights flickering overhead. It wasn't ideal, but I had to agree with him. I couldn't imagine making the whole trip back after getting to the gas station. Either way, I think we need to stay together, I posited. He nodded slowly. "Maybe we should stay here." I couldn't deny it was tempting. It felt good to be out of the storm. But though it was warmer in here, it wasn't fully heated. "We feel warmer now," I said. "But is it warm enough to stay here? And if we wait too long, will we even be able to get anywhere else?" I asked. Overhead the light flickered again, ominously. Metal considered this. "If we head back home, we could probably make it to the chain link fence, but after that, I'm not sure. The backyard was uphill. We may not be able to get to the back door. If we can't, we'll have to go around. So we are stuck deciding if we should try to camp down here or keep going to the gas station where at least we would have food and bathrooms and cigarettes," I concluded. In the end, it was the flickering light, threatening a power outage, that made our decision for us. Without power, the foyer would become cold dangerously quickly. As we bundled back up, a gap in the snow revealed a bright glow in the direction of the gas station before the storm rushed back in again and it disappeared in the swirling chaos. It bolstered both our moods. I was glad we were leaving the foyer. The longer we sat, the more the swirls against the glass seemed to resemble faces, staring with dead eyes of white swirling snow. Dead eyes that looked at me. Dead eyes that saw me. I don't know if Metal's eyes were playing the same tricks on him. I thought about asking, but he suddenly stood up and pulled his last smoke out of the pack. He lit it with a flare, zipped up his coat, and saluted, cigarette hanging from the corner of his mouth, just below one squinted eye. "Soldier!" he shouted. "We will go out in that snow. We will walk across this street. We will acquire snacks. Those are our orders, maggot. Get your ass out there." He threw his scarf over one shoulder with a flourish and kicked open the door. The jovial moment ended as the snow hit us like we'd never left it. Metal grabbed me before I could start walking, and I realized he was standing with his back to the bank window to orient himself, so we walked in the right direction. It was smart because the gas station was catty-corner from where we were standing. The road we had to cross had 2 lanes with parking on both. From the bank to the door of the station wasn't more than 60 feet. Even though it was dark outside, the swirling blizzard created the illusion of visibility, but that's all that it is, an illusion. The reality was that we could not see more than a couple of feet in any direction. We knew there was a car parked in front of the bank, but beyond that, it would be the last physical landmark until we made it to the pumps of the gas station. We moved carefully forward to the parked car, edging our way around it to the right. Something in the snow banged against my leg, causing me to jump back and fall on my ass in the snow. When I got back up, I reached out to find a parking meter buried in the snow next to the car. That was going to hurt later, and probably leave a pretty nasty bruise, too. I thought at first Metal hadn't noticed that I fell. I shouted his name and felt the panic start to rise when his outstretched hand appeared in front of me. We clasped hands and started moving forward again. I felt no shame in holding a guy's hand at this point. I just didn't want to be alone. It's hard for your senses to cope in that sort of environment. Sound is muffled, directions become elusive, you can see but you are also blind. But even though everything is hidden from you, you can't stop trying to see and to hear just in case, for one brief moment, you can get your bearings. I'll be honest. I was starting to get pretty freaked out. The panic I felt was threatening to boil over. Being in the storm felt like being underwater, slow and foreign. Pretty, but deadly. I ran into something again, this time with my right leg. What the fuck, I said, reaching down to see what I had hit this time, but after fishing around for whatever it might be, I came up empty. You okay? Metal said, shouting with his head close to mine. Even a few inches away, he sounded muffled and distant. Yeah. I shouted back and we continued trudging forward. There was no point pretending we weren't pretty thoroughly run down at this point. I mean, we were both young, but we were also smokers. We were much more likely to be found playing guitar on top of the student union than in an intramural football game. At this point, the snow was closing in waist deep and it was almost impossible to step over it anymore. I worked to make a simple rhythm of it. Pick up your leg, like you're marching. Pull it up and slide it back down in the snow. Then bring your other leg up to meet it. I would lead with my right foot for a while, then alternate to my left. We walked and walked in time stretched out behind us. Any sense I had of our position and pace was long gone. How long had we been walking? We left the house around 7, but neither of us was wearing watches. The more I thought about it, the harder it was to figure out. I decided it had probably been a half hour or so when you factor in the 2 cigarettes they had at the bank. How long would it take to get to the gas station? I concentrated on my footsteps. How many steps would it have taken me on a regular day to get from the bank to the gas station? I tried to pace it off in my head as I forced my legs to push through the snow. It was maybe 6 steps from the bank to the car, and 8 steps around the car to where I got whacked by the parking meter. Probably about 15 steps if we went directly across the street. So crossways across the intersection would be, say 30, maybe even 35 paces. From the curb to the gas pumps would add another 15 or so. If I counted 2 snow steps for every good weather regular step, that would put me at about 130 snow steps to get to the pumps. But you see, I honestly thought my snow steps were larger than regular steps based on how I had to put my foot down, but I was trying to be as conservative as possible. Was Metal doing the same? I hoped so, because, at this point, any energy I had left after walking was being used to keep me from losing my shit. I counted in my head as we went. 1, and 2, and 3, and... When I got to 150, I knew something was very, very wrong. I was about to try to ask Metal what he thought when lightning flashed all around us, revealing swirls of blues and whites and thick patches like clouds, but with no visible boundary between the falling snow and the snow on the ground. Thunder cracked loud overhead and seemed to echo around us. Like the thunder before, the snow that followed landed on us like a blanket. It was up to our waist now. We fought to shake it off our arms and shoulders, but we could both feel it. The storm was gaining on us. I moved in front of Metal and took the front for a while. He had been forging the path for long enough. He had to be exhausted. I leaned in and shouted in his ear, "We should have been there by now." I got a quick glimpse of his eyes, a few inches from mine. He only gave a small nod. There was nothing we could do but keep walking. 157 and 158 and... Just then I tripped over something and fell forward, face first into the snow. I panicked and flailed. The snow was packed in my mouth and ears. It was hard to breathe, and for a second I couldn't get away from it. It was like being underwater without any buoyancy. Metal's hand had been ripped out of mine when I got knocked over. I finally found my feet and felt around with my arms until I bumped into him and we clutched each other in the darkness. Before I could take another step, I ran into something else and suddenly realized I wasn't running into something. Something was running into me. This time it was Metal's turn to fall on his ass, and my turn to help him up. But as I was pulling him onto his feet, the snow rippled around us, and without warning, Metal's hand was torn out of mine and he disappeared back down into the snow. I felt wildly for his hand and managed to get a hold of it, but Metal hadn't fallen. Something was pulling him. I could hear his thin, terrified screams being swallowed by the wind and snow. "Don't let go," he cried. I pulled my right glove off with my teeth and got my bare hand up under his sleeve, wrapped around his bare skin for traction. His warm skin felt hot and prickly against my cold fingers, but I held on as hard as I could, even when I knew that it had to hurt him like hell where I was pulling. Whatever had his legs yanked harder. The storm thickened. I could hear Metal screaming, but I couldn't see his face. Whatever had him pulled over and over until I felt like my arm was going to get ripped out of its socket. Lightning blew up the sky around us. For a moment, I could see Metal in front of me, his face pale with exertion and pain, his eyes wild with fear. I wished that was all I had seen, but the flashes of lightning showed so much more. Around us, in the layers of the light bursts, huge pale eel-like creatures swirled through the falling snow like water, the snow swirling like eddies in their wake. I could tell that Metal had seen them too. Then I felt it again, the movement under the snow, bumping hard against my leg. Jesus Christ, there was something alive out here with us. The next time the lightning flashed, I watched as white tendrils of snow slithered up from the snow behind Metal and wrapped themselves around his arms and then around his neck. The force of it made his eyes bulge and his skin began to turn purple. I shouldn't have been able to see any of it, or at least not as much as I saw. I know it sounds crazy, but it felt like the lightning kept flashing to make sure I saw the thing taking Metal. To make sure I saw him die. Because there's no way he could have lived. I wanted to believe he could, but deep down, from that moment I knew. The thunder cracked and the storm went black and Metal's hands were violently ripped from mine in a white-hot sheet of pain that tore through my shoulder as my grip on his arm was broken. All I saw after that was a flash of black as Metal disappeared into the ocean of snow. I clutched my now useless arm against my chest and tried to look around. Tried to see anything in the darkness. The snow was deeper now. In a little while it wouldn't matter what was out there, I wouldn't be able to keep going. My good hand was numb and my feet felt like blocks of stone I had to drag along underneath me. My eyes were tired from squinting and trying to make out anything in the darkness. For a while, every time I contemplated giving up, the things in the snow would nudge me, toying with me like a cat with a mouse. But a person can only keep moving for so long in those conditions, no matter how determined they are. I just kept pushing forward in the direction I thought the gas station was. By that point, I had stopped counting steps. I could only concentrate on one step at a time now. If I could just keep going, I still had a chance, right? A wild shrieking suddenly whipped in the wind around me just as something struck me hard in the face, nearly knocking me off my feet. A hot wetness trickled down my cheek and onto my coat. Suddenly, brilliant white light flashed and flooded the world around me, followed by a turbulence slithering around my legs and waist under the snow. But this time, the lightning revealed something else. The gas station. Metal and I had gotten off course, and I had nearly missed it. I lunged in the direction of it, had been in great flailing strides that felt like running underwater, a slow-motion escape more frustrating than any nightmare. But I had seen the gas station. I knew I could make it. Instead, I was knocked violently forward, face first in the snow. Before I could get my knees under me, an ice-cold tendril wound around the wrist of my bad arm and yanked it back, brutally, causing pain to cut through my consciousness like a white-hot blade. The adrenaline gave me just enough energy to take a few more steps. Blood was pouring down my face, and I was dragging my now useless arm behind me in the snow. The thunder boomed right above me, and I knew the snow was coming, and that would be the end. I knew deep down that I could not shrug off another dumping of the heavy snow. Not that I didn't try, but as it hit me, I fell forward, limply. The thing swirled around me in the snow, rubbing against my legs, then disappearing, only to be replaced by another one. Then a sharp pain bit through the haze I was in. Something had sliced the back of my leg. The jolt of surprise and the new pain helped me to get to my feet again, even as I could feel more of them swimming through my legs and around my waist. The lightning flashed one last time, and there, in front of me, were hands and arms that reached out to me, pulling me out of the snow. Behind me, I felt the tendrils wrapping around my legs and ankles, the sharp slicing of the skin on my thighs and calves. I screamed in pain from the cuts and being torn in two. I kicked at the thing swirling around my feet, and suddenly, my foot was purchased with something hard and resistant. Very much like packed snow. But I felt it give, and then the thing holding my feet loosened its grip just enough to allow the hands and arms to tear me free of it. Human hands and arms that were real and warm and alive. It was there, on the concrete just outside the door of the gas station, that I closed my eyes and everything went quietly, mercifully dark. It was around 3 a.m. when I woke up and found myself lying on the floor behind the counter of the gas station, my head resting on a package of toilet paper. I tried to sit up and was instantly blinded by white-hot pain as I had never felt before. I cried out and was quickly surrounded by the clerk and two other girls. All three had extremely concerned looks on their faces. "Are you okay?" The clerk said nervously. "Of course, he's not okay," said the girl on the left. "He's inside and he's alive." "That's okay enough," the girl on the right said grimly. She screwed the cap off a bottle of Captain Morgan and handed it to me. "Take these," she said, holding up 2 pills and then putting them in my mouth. I was too surprised to resist. "Drink," she said, pushing the bottle of rum toward my face. I washed down the mystery pills with the rum, and while it burned going down, it was warm, and everything warm was good. My friend. He was with me. "Have you seen him? Did he make it here?" I asked. The 2 girls shook their heads. "You're the first one since we got here. Our car got stuck. It wasn't bad then. But we were going to try to get it unstuck, only we didn't get to the car." The girls looked at one another and were quiet. "There are things in the snow," I said. No use pretending it wasn't true. Tears rolled down one of the girl's cheeks. "I need to call my roommates," I said. "Phones are out," the clerk replied, frowning, then she shrugged. The four of us sat behind the counter for the rest of the night. The girls' names were Sarah and Braden. The clerk was Jill. I told them some of what happened, but not all. It turned out the pills Braden gave me were serious painkillers she took for monster cramps. The slices on my legs were wide, but not dangerously deep. I was able to move around once the pain ebbed a bit. "What time did I get here?" I asked, at some point, trying to pin down the sequence of events. Jill brought over 3 hot chocolates from what my roommate called the cappuccino machine. Braden topped all 3 off with rum. 7:15, she said. "That can't be right," I said. "We didn't even leave until 7. And we stopped at the bank for at least 10 minutes, probably more." "No, that's right," Sarah said, taking a sip of her hot chocolate. "When we got you inside, I looked at the clock so I would know how long you were out. I know it was 7:15-ish because I remember thinking my sorority sisters would all be in the TV room watching Friends." "It can't be right," I said quietly, and the girls didn't contradict me. For the rest of the night, we stayed behind the counter on the floor. It was better not to have the windows to look out of. Better not to be where you can be seen if something was looking in. Sarah and Braden eventually fell asleep. Jill and I smoked and endured the flashes of lightning and thunder in the snow. I tried not to think of what was out there, but I never succeeded. I guess we all must have fallen asleep eventually. When I opened my eyes, the light from outside was bright and clear. The snow had drifted halfway up the window, but above the snow line, I could see the bars and pizza places half buried in a fine powdery snow that was perfectly smooth and flat and glittered like diamonds. We still couldn't go anywhere, but we did eventually get phone service back. When we did, I called my roommates to tell them I was okay and to ask if Metal was there, but he hadn't returned to the house. I even made them look upstairs. Over the next few days, there would be a lot of questions and a lot of heartache. I tried to tell people what happened, but I couldn't get anyone to take me seriously. They nodded and gave me a pitying look. To them, it was just my traumatized mind making up a story to cope with the horrific event I had lived through. And who knows, maybe I am. But there's one thing that makes me think I do remember things the way they happened. They eventually found Metal. Found his body, anyway. The day after the storm, the owner of the bar across the street went to drop his deposit at the bank. The drop box is in the foyer by the ATM. As he turned to go, he noticed, down in the corner window, by the floor, he could see a pale face, with white that stared off into nowhere. It was Metal. He was found lying next to the window with his face pressed up against the glass, completely frozen. The authorities declared it was death by exposure, but I'm betting they found a lot more in that autopsy than anyone was ever told. Once the storm had cleared, 4 people had gotten lost in the storm and suffered the same fate as Metal. I wonder how many of them suffered the same fate. I've never really been 100% okay since then. Physically, I've recovered as much as I am going to. My right arm is moderately functional, but I'm a lefty now. I transferred to the University of Arizona for my junior and senior years. After graduation, I did outreach work at the equator. I don't go where it snows anymore, and I'm okay with that. But a few weeks ago, I happened to run across a headline about thundersnow predictions in the Midwest this winter. I know Midwesterners are brave and sometimes reckless, but this is not a normal kind of storm. From one Midwesterner to another, if you hear thunder in a snowstorm, run. I was hunted by a cryptid in a snowstorm. I never thought it would end like this. My truck's windows smashed, blood all over the interior, the frigid wind and snow blowing in on me as those two empty eyes stared in at me like a predator sizing up a helpless animal for the kill. It didn't start like that, of course. When I started for my morning run, it wasn't snowing. There was snow on the ground. There had been a quick storm with some squalls that left half a foot of the white stuff on the roads just a few days earlier. The state took care of it pretty quickly, and travel was barely interrupted. Everyone went about their merry way. Even me. The fact that I hated winter even more than driving a truck never entered my mind. Okay, that was a lie. As I drove down the road, I found myself looking at the small piles of snow along the roadside and cursing them for not being big enough to cancel my run. I had to drive my truck through some pretty empty places. The kind that made you long for anything to break up the monotony of 2 lanes of asphalt surrounded by endless trees. I had to drive that route quite often, and it never got any easier to stay awake. I would even imagine seeing odd things looking out of the trees as I flew by. I knew it was my mind playing tricks on me, trying to scare me into staying alert and not crashing the truck. If it had been a deer or bear or something like that, I would have just laughed it off, but this thing looked like it was out of some nightmare. That's how I knew it wasn't real. There was no way it could exist, so I put it out of my mind and kept on driving. Fortunately, with it being a 2-day run, I was able to pick where I wanted to stay after I got my load. Hotels were nice, but if needed I had the sleeper in my cab, which I called home away from home. It wasn't as bad as cramped spaces go. There was lots of shelf space above the bunk. I had a TV mounted on the wall hooked up to a GameCube. There was a DVD player with an assortment of movies that I rotated out every week. And there were some paperback books. Lord of the Rings, Frankenstein, This Present Darkness, along with all the indie author books I had on my phone. I didn't have to worry about being bored. There was always my laptop that held the novels I'd started writing and never finished. The only thing I needed was food and a bathroom. I had snacks stashed around, sometimes in places even I hadn't found for months. But it couldn't compare to a nice hot meal. I had my favorite stops on the road, and they all had 2 things in common: good food and a quiet place to park and sleep. I didn't like having my truck squashed up against other trucks, wondering if I would be able to get my door open if they parked like an idiot. I liked parking near the outskirts of a parking lot. It was more private, and I didn't feel as hemmed in. Of course, there was a trade-off. More privacy meant walking further to get to the truck stop. Sometimes a lot further. But I used that to my advantage. Nothing like a nice long walk to get the blood flowing to all those muscles I didn't use when driving. Unfortunately, the place was a local mom-and-pop operation, which meant they didn't have the money to stay open 24 hours a day. Usually, I would pull my truck into my spot in the evening, go get supper at the lunch counter, and then grab supplies for the night. I'd always go inside one last time to use the restroom just before they closed at midnight. That evening, I followed the same pattern. Pulled in, walked to the store, got some supper, and went back in around 11:30 for restroom and supplies before going back to my truck and falling asleep. Normally, I try to keep a good watch on upcoming weather. For whatever reason, I hadn't that day. I woke up around 8 a.m. and looked out to a sea of white. It had snowed, and it had snowed hard. It looked like someone wanted to make up for the snow quota this winter and did it all in 8 hours. I dressed in my cold weather gear and went out to see how bad it was and if my truck would be going anywhere today. When I jumped out of the cab, my legs disappeared. There was at least 2 feet of snow on the ground, and it was still putting it down. I trudged around the truck to make sure everything was okay, then got back in the cab, brushing off as much snow as I could first. I climbed into the bunk and turned on the news to the announcement that a major blizzard had hit the area. Wow, I thought. That's some great investigative reporting right there. They were calling for another foot before the snow stopped. Great, time to call the boss and get my ear chewed off. Why can't you get here? He growled. There's this stuff called snow, I said. It lands on the ground and piles up until it begins to impede travel. All right, smartass, when do you think you can be here? Well, seeing that I haven't even seen a snowplow go by and I'm sitting in a parking lot that probably won't get plowed out until much later than the highways, on top of the fact that my tires are nearly bald even though I've been telling you for months they needed to be changed, I'll say I have no earthly clue when you'll see your precious cargo. He was silent for a long moment. Do you like your job? He said through barely restrained fury. Not particularly, I said. Then added, when the weather's like this. You might want to update your resume. With that, the line went dead. Thank you for your support, I said to the dial tone. I settled back in, turned off the TV, and went back to sleep. When I first started in trucking, a fellow driver gave me a tip that I never forgot. Anytime you have the chance to get some rest, take it. That little tidbit helped me tremendously over the years. A little extra sleep means a lot less coffee. When I woke a few hours later and peeked outside, it was still snowing. I looked out my driver's side window and even my tracks were gone. I was feeling the call of nature and decided to brave the elements to take the trek to the truck stop for some relief. I felt a little silly for putting on all my cold weather gear, including gloves and goggles. That feeling didn't last long. It was snowing so hard I couldn't even see the truck stop. I drew an invisible line with the side of my truck, aimed in that direction, and started walking. I never read Call of the Wild. I never saw Alive. Maybe if I had, I wouldn't have been so eager to throw myself out into this blizzard just to go pee. Trudging through the snow and the driving wind was growing old quickly. I felt like I should have reached the truck stop by now. I paused and looked around. 2 realizations hit me at the same time. First, I couldn't see the truck stop. Second, I could no longer see the truck. As a lovely addition, my tracks were quickly disappearing. I tried to focus on my path toward the truck stop and began trudging again. 15 minutes later, I believe by sheer luck, I saw the store appear off to the right. My track hadn't been dead on, but I was close enough to find the place. My winter gear was starting to fail me, especially with the wind finding all the little places it could inject frigid air. As I approached, I breathed a sigh of relief at getting in out of the cold, not to mention a massive cup of steaming hot coffee. I reached for the door, but it refused to open. Maybe it was frozen shut. I pulled harder, but nothing happened. I looked in through the glass and saw no lights on. It struck me how the walkway wasn't shoveled either. Oh no, I thought. The storm has them stuck at home. My hopes for a nice warm toilet and a steaming hot cup of coffee plummeted. I took one last forlorn look at the dark store and turned back toward my truck. My disappointment grew as I realized my tracks were gone. I was now snowblind and navigating without a compass or any means of direction. I tried to draw an invisible line with the outer wall of the store and hoped it would lead me back to the truck. I felt my cold, wet feet protest as I headed back toward the warmth of my truck. I hugged my jacket, attempting to keep the wind out. The snow was up past my knees now and seemed like trudging through mud. In retrospect, it would have been better for me to wait in the truck until I saw a snowplow in the parking lot. I had plenty of empty tea bottles for bathroom emergencies. But there was no use chiding myself now. I had to get back to the truck to keep this mistake from becoming a fatal one. If I got lost and couldn't find the truck, no one would come looking for me. They might not find my frozen body until spring thaw. That was a cheery thought. As if my journey hadn't been hard enough, after a while, something caught my foot and sent me sprawling face first in the snow. I struggled to right myself and quickly wiped the snow from my face, silently thanking God that I had worn the goggles. I tried to get my bearings again, but curiosity nagged at me. What had I tripped on in the middle of a parking lot? I dug down and discovered the offending object. It was a parking space barrier. I chuckled for a moment until I realized to my horror that I should never have come near any of these in the middle of the lot. A straight trail from the store to the truck. The barrier I had tripped on would be a couple of dozen yards to the right. I scraped the rest of it off and saw it was running nearly parallel to my path. I had veered off course badly. The bright side was, I now had a point of reference and hopefully could correct my course. I looked around and found myself adrift in a sea of white. The store had disappeared, and the truck was nowhere to be found. I took a deep breath and used the barrier to aim toward where the truck should be. I remembered one key fact in the process. These barriers lined the edge of the parking lot, and just past them was a drop-off. In retrospect, it was lucky I had tripped on it instead of stepping over it and rolling down a hill so that I might never make it back up again. I turned to aim myself where I thought my truck was when out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw a shadow of a figure walk by. I couldn't be sure because the blowing snow made visibility nearly impossible more than a few yards away. It could have just been my imagination. I'd been out in the cold for much longer than I planned, and it was time to get back to the truck. I was suddenly reminded why I got out of the truck, to begin with. I had to pee so badly. I did a quick look and saw nothing but snow, so I whipped it out and let it go. I think whipping it out was a bit of an oversimplification. I fought to unzip my frozen zipper as my bladder screamed a full red alert that it was about to release the floodgates whether I was ready or not. I finally got it out and started the yellow stream when the wind shifted direction, sending it spraying all over my pants. I quickly turned so that the stream was downwind. When I finished, I looked down at the front of my now wet pants and swore internally. Yet another reason to find the truck quickly. Wet pants turned to frozen pants turned to dangerous pants. I looked down at the barrier now covered in flecks of yellow snow and started on my new course. The snow had not let up one bit and my energy started to wane even though I had just been standing around for the last 10 minutes. Trudging through nearly waist-high snow was making me more tired than I had been in a long time. The wind rushing in my ears tore away my hearing. There wasn't anything out here to listen to, and yet I thought I heard something. I looked around, but only saw white. Was this my mind starting to play tricks on me like it did when I was driving and thought I saw the creature that didn't exist peeking out at me from the trees? I turned back to my imagined destination wondering if delusions were the first step in freezing to death. As if to answer, the wind hit me with a solid gust, knocking me down. If I didn't know better, I'd swear I felt a giant hand in the middle of my back before I fell. I looked up and saw nothing but snow, swirling around making mini tornadoes. I chuckled at the irony of them being called snow devils. I guess my personal snow devil was pushing me around. I got up and started for the truck again. Every step felt like my feet were encased in concrete. I plodded on, trying to pull from whatever reserve energy I had to keep going. I couldn't die in the middle of a parking lot just yards away from my nice, warm truck. That would be the ultimate irony. I walked on, barely conscious, wanting only my 18-wheeled safe harbor from this merciless storm. My head was down. I wasn't even looking anymore. It didn't make any difference. I knew I would never find it. I knew it was like looking for a needle in a field of haystacks. There was no way I would ever get BA. I slammed into something and fell back. The snow was so deep I just lay there like a turtle, unable to get off my back. I looked up and saw the thing that had hit me was the back corner of the truck. 2 feet to the right and I would have missed it. I smiled, but it took a lot of energy. I focused everything I had on getting up. Adrenaline took care of the rest. I marched up to the driver's side door and reached into my pocket for the key to unlock it. I couldn't find the key. I ripped off my glove and searched again. Still no key. Despair smothered my mind. If I had dropped it one of the times I fell in the snow, it was lost forever, and so was I. I leaned against the truck door, so close and yet so far. I could almost feel the heat through it. I smashed my fist into my leg in frustration, but felt more pain than I should have. I patted the other pocket and felt a lump. I tore off my other glove and reached into the pocket, pulling out the holiest of holies, the key. Tears streamed down my face and quickly froze as I stuck the key in the lock and opened the door. It took every ounce of energy I had left to climb up into the cab and collapse into the driver's seat. A wave of heat washed over me. For the longest time, I just sat there until I mustered the strength to start pulling off my cold weather gear. One piece at a time, I threw them into the passenger seat until I sat in my underwear only. I leaned my seat back and basked in the warmth that flowed over me like an ocean wave. I imagined sitting on a beach with the sun shining down on me and the water beckoning. I fell asleep like this. I woke to a sore back and stretched as best I could in my seat, then looked out the windshield. The snow seemed to have let up a little bit and the wind wasn't nearly as fierce as before. There was still no sign of a plow, and there was no way I was getting anywhere without one. Off in the distance, I could almost see the outline of the store. I wasn't going there again until the parking lot was plowed. But looking around, I couldn't imagine how long that might be. There was at least 3 feet of snow already on the ground, and it was still putting some down. I crawled into the bunk and covered up for a serious nap. Hours later, I was starting to feel refreshed. I rolled over and turned on the TV, trying to see how bad things were. I couldn't even pick up the local station, so I stuck in a movie. After it was done, I decided I should probably take stock of my supplies since I might be here for a while. I had plenty of snacks, chips, pretzels, and jerky, among other things. As long as I didn't binge, I should have been fine. I had drinks in the mini fridge too, but water wasn't a concern. All I had to do was bring some snow inside and melt it. I only needed to check one last thing to make sure I could outlast this storm. I looked at the fuel gauge. I rubbed my eyes and looked at the fuel gauge again. I only had a quarter tank left. That might last and it might not, depending on how long it took to get plowed out. Once the plow freed me, I could drive 100 yards or so to a gas pump. As I was looking at the fuel gauge, my eyes drifted to the windshield and the field of white that stretched out in front of me. The snow had finally stopped. How long that would last, I had no idea. I could finally see the store clearly, but I could also see clearly that it remained closed. It was hard to believe anyone would be plowing that amount of snow anywhere. I guess that's why they had the drop-off along the edges of the parking lot. As I softly chuckled at my realization, my eyes caught movement. There was some kind of animal walking around in the parking lot. At first, I thought it was a deer because of the wide horns on its head, but the longer I looked, the more I realized this creature was something else. It seemed bigger than any deer I'd ever seen. Its torso rode above the snow like it was a ship. Its face looked like it had wasted away to the bare skull, and it had massive teeth that went far beyond its jaw. It was rather haunting to look at. It was sniffing around in the snow. The more I thought about it, I began to realize that was probably the spot where I had taken a leak. I was mesmerized and horrified by this thing at the same time. I was nearly convinced my mind was playing a trick on me when it looked right at me and my blood turned to ice. Its look pierced my soul and made me wish I'd never come to this place. When it took its first step in my direction, I dove back into the sleeper and drew the curtain. I shook for reasons that had nothing to do with the temperature and was breathing in panicked gasps. What was that thing? Did I see what I thought I saw? How could a creature like that exist? I tried to settle down and get my breathing back to normal, but my mind refused to let go of the image of that thing. It's just my imagination, I told myself. It's just a deer roaming around out there. I told myself that same thing over and over until my mind finally believed it. However, I didn't look through the curtain to confirm it. I didn't call it denial, I called it not pushing my luck. I pulled out a pack of cheese crackers and turned on the first Die Hard movie to try and forget about the deer outside. I was 15 minutes into the movie when I felt the first nudge. I didn't know what else to call it. It felt like something just nudged my truck. It was almost like when a strong wind gust pushed the cab. But I didn't hear any wind outside. The two sides of my mind engaged in a shouting match over whether I should check it out or ignore it. Fear threw its 2 cents in and ignore it won out until the second nudge. It was like the 5th or 6th nudge until curiosity took over and made me go take a look. I peeked through the curtain and didn't see anything but snow through the windshield. I climbed out and looked through the passenger's window but saw nothing. I chided myself for my skittishness when I looked through the driver's side window and saw a set of horns. I rubbed my eyes and looked again, but they were gone. There were tracks in the snow that looked like deer tracks, only bigger. Or was that my imagination carrying me away again? I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the creature poking at my tires with its horns. I was fairly sure it couldn't puncture one with just horns, but I didn't want to change it. I reached down, grabbed my club, and opened the door to scare it away, but again, it was gone. I was beginning to question my sanity. Was this thing real? Was it my mind playing tricks on me? Or was the creature toying with me, trying to draw me out of the truck? I closed the door and went back to my movie, but I couldn't get that creature out of my head. I was on pins and needles waiting, listening, anticipating the next nudge. Before the movie was over, I fell into a fitful sleep. I was in a tall building and there were bad guys everywhere. I had a machine gun but had been better served hiding and picking them off one by one. I was sneaking up on one who was standing guard on an isolated floor when I turned the corner and there stood the deer creature. It was massive, standing on its hind legs, and its horns scraped the ceiling. It looked at me with those empty eye sockets from its bare skull face. It made a sound that was half grunt, half growl, then started towards me. I backed away around the corner, trying to get back to my hiding space, but as I turned to run, suddenly the creature was in front of me. I pulled up my machine gun and started firing short bursts. I hit it in the chest, but it kept coming. As I backed away, I shot it several times in the head. I watched as chunks of bone flew, but it kept coming as if it didn't care. I shot at its legs, hoping to throw it off balance, but it had no effect. As if it had had enough, it charged, pinning me to a wall with its horns. I looked down as the blood began to seep from my belly around its horns. It pulled back and charged me again and again, sending shockwaves of pain through my body and crushing my spine. It pulled back and allowed me to fall to the floor. Blood pooled around me as I tried to crawl away from the creature. I could only use my arms. I couldn't feel anything below my waist, which was a partial blessing because it cut my pain in half. After I had crawled a few feet, I suppose it had enough of toying with me. It stomped its foot down on my neck so hard I heard a snap and my arms went dead. I could feel it tear into my back, ripping away pieces of meat. I could hear the sickening chewing and slurping as I was eaten alive. I woke with a start, sweat pouring from my forehead, and looked around the sleeper cab looking for the creature that was tearing me to pieces. After a few seconds, I came to the realization it had been a nightmare. I turned off my DVD player and stuck my head out through the curtain to check on my fuel situation. The needle was well below the quarter mark, almost down to an eighth. I looked out through the windshield and the snow had not magically melted. The wind had picked up and now it was starting to drift. Where there was once an even field of snow, now peaks and valleys were forming, like dunes in the desert. The store was still dark and there was no traffic moving on the road. The sun was riding low in the sky and I had yet to see another living soul. I wondered if my fuel would last until a plow could rescue me. Soon I would have to give some serious thought to conserving. It wasn't ideal. The thought of bundling up in blankets in the dark with no heater and no TV to watch wasn't exciting me, but it was better than waiting until my fuel ran out and I froze to death. As I killed the engine, I chided myself for not coming up with this plan sooner. I would have conserved fuel when the sun was out and the temperatures were higher. Now I was going to pay for my lack of foresight. I dug out every blanket I had stored in my closets and laid them over the bed, then tucked in for a long nap. When I woke, I was drowning in utter darkness. I panicked for a moment before I remembered where I was. I looked at my watch and it was 4 a.m. I pulled the covers off me and was immediately assaulted by cold air. I grabbed a flashlight and found my way into the cab. I turned the key on and waited with bated breath that billowed out in clouds that filled the cab until the engine turned over. As it roared to life, I felt even colder. I looked to my left and froze. My driver's side window lay in pieces on the seat and floor. I slowly turned to look at the passenger's side window when fear grabbed me. There was a face looking in at me. But it wasn't a human face, it was the ungodly face of the dear creature that had gored me to death in my dream. A river ran down my leg, forming a yellow puddle on the floor as I stared into the dark hollow eyes of this thing sent straight from hell. It reared its head back and then smashed into my passenger's window, splintering it. It reared back again and this time shattered the window, reaching in for me with its fierce long teeth. I jumped back and landed in the driver's seat full of glass. I knew I was dead. There was nothing I could do. I sat there as it entered the cab, coming for me. Its head was halfway inside when it suddenly stopped. It moved around a little bit, then roared in frustration. Its horns were too wide to fit in the window. It tried over and over to get in, but there was no way it could fit with the horns. As suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. I looked around to see where it had gone, but the darkness of night covered it like a shroud. As I was looking, it silently reached in behind me and would have had me if it hadn't breathed out, warning me of its approach. I dove into the center console as its deadly jaw snapped shut right where my spine had been. It continued its assault on this window, gaining ferocity as it frustrated itself by not being able to get a hold of me. I stood in between the two windows, hoping I was safe from either direction. It was then I decided to go back into my bunk and close the curtain. I covered up, reached underneath the bunk to a secret compartment, and pulled out my .40 caliber automatic handgun. I took the magazine out and made sure it was loaded with all 10 rounds, then put it back in, pulled back the slide, and flicked on the safety. It made me feel a little better, but not much. I didn't know how true my dream was, or if bullets would do anything to this monster. I no longer had any illusions that this was a deer. It was something much more dangerous and terrifying, and it was after me. I covered up with my blankets again, holding my gun close. The heater wasn't doing much good with 2 windows broken out. I would try to do something about them in the morning when it was light. There was no way I was doing anything in the dark with that thing lurking out there. I lay there for an hour watching every second of the clock tick by, eyes wide open, ears listening for any sound. But there was none, just the wind howling in between the 2 broken windows, making my curtains flutter. Eventually, I recognized the futility of having a truck running and the warm air just escaping before it could even get to me. So I got out of my bunk, keeping my new best friend with me, and slowly made my way out to the cab, my head darting left and right to see if the creature was about to launch itself through either of the windows. I turned the key off, and before I could pull it out of the ignition, a set of horns smacked against the frame of the window, and the deadly teeth came in and snapped just inches short of my face. I whipped around and pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. It snapped at me again, and I panicked until I realized the safety was on. I flicked it off and aimed, but the monster was gone. I didn't dare make a move toward the window for fear it would launch itself back in at me. I stood still as a statue and stared at the window it had come through, then slowly turned to the other side. I kept looking back and forth between the 2, trying to keep my peripheral vision on both at the same time. I was shaking, not only from the cold, but also from the sheer terror of not knowing where or when this thing was going to show itself. I decided my cold weather gear would be my best option, so I climbed back into the bunk and put on as many layers of clothes as I could find. When I popped my head back out, I was met with the most terrifying sight imaginable. The monster had climbed onto the hood of my truck and was now bashing its head against the windshield, trying to make its way inside. I knew the windshield was wide enough that it would be able to get its antlers inside, and I would be done. I pulled the gun up, aimed at its head, and fired. The explosion was massive. I instantly lost my hearing except for the ringing in my ears. I staggered back, but the monster kept coming. Not only had my bullet done nothing to the monster, it weakened the windshield, making it easier to get inside. The monster shook its head in surprise when the bullet ricocheted off the bone, and then continued its assault on the windshield. It hammered on the glass until it shattered into a million pieces. I was already aiming at its face and fired 2 shots before the glass even hit the floor. They both ricocheted off its skull, causing it to rear up just enough for me to fire 2 shots into its chest. It didn't collapse screaming in agony like I wanted, but I could tell it didn't like it either. It jumped down off the hood and disappeared. I stared out into the inky blackness, trying in vain to pick up any glimpse of it. I whipped around from one side window to the other and back again, waiting for it to show its horrid face. After what seemed like forever, I saw horns rising through the passenger side window. I fired a shot into its face, and it disappeared. I threw myself back into the passenger seat when suddenly I saw its head rising in the driver's side window. I fired a shot, making it disappear again. I jumped up and threw myself to the other seat, knowing it would be on the passenger's side soon. Sure enough, 10 seconds later, it appeared and I fired another shot. It was toying with me. It disappeared and I threw myself over into the passenger's seat, waiting, aiming at the empty driver's window. But instead, I felt teeth clamp down on my neck. It had fooled me. I shoved my gun up under its skull and fired a shot. If I hadn't been deaf from the first shot, this one right next to my ear would have done it. And yet somehow I heard it squeal in pain as it released me. I knew I had been inches from death. I reached up and touched the wound on my neck and came away with a handful of blood. I went back into my bunk, tore away a piece of sheet, and pressed it to my wound. Then I tore some more of the sheet and tied it around my neck to hold the bandage in place. I went back out to the cab only to see it crouching on the hood waiting for me. I never thought it would end like this. My truck's windows smashed blood all over the interior, the frigid wind and snow blowing in as those two empty eyes stared in at me like a predator sizing up a helpless animal for the kill. It crawled in through the remains of the windshield. I knew I was dead. In desperation, I shoved the gun into one of its eye holes and squeezed the trigger. The sound it made was something I'd never heard before and never wanted to hear again. The scream was both a low guttural sound and a high-pitched shriek. It sounded like someone had unleashed a demon from the pits of hell. My mind screamed at me, "Get out of there!" I fumbled with the driver's door and ended up falling out when it opened. On a clear day, with no snow, I would have gotten a concussion or broken bone falling on the bare asphalt. With 3 feet of snow on the ground, I landed on a soft, cold pillow. It was the only time in the last 24 hours that the snow had helped me. I immediately jumped up and looked around for any place to hide. But there was nowhere. Everything was covered in snow. I glanced back at the trailer and realized the snow was so high that it reached the bottom of the trailer. I couldn't see underneath at all. I quickly dove under it, then turned around and tried to pile snow into the opening to hide where I had gone. I shone my light around at the beautiful sight of bare asphalt. I lay there on my belly, looking all around, trying to see in every direction at once to see where the monster would attack from. My breath blew out in billows of desperate smoke as I came up empty. There was nothing. The monster wasn't there. Yet. I didn't dare hope to imagine that my shot had killed it. If anything, it made it even angrier. It was probably destroying the inside of my truck at that very moment. What I didn't trust was that the monster wouldn't find me underneath the trailer. I looked around for anywhere I could use as a better hiding place. My eyes fell on the wheels of the truck. It looked like there was just enough room between the tires and the differential. It would be a tight squeeze, but it was better than that thing finding me. I turned around and slid my feet in first. The further I slid, the tighter it got. Ironically, the grease and oil from the differential helped me slide through a little easier. When I almost had my shoulders through, it suddenly felt too tight. I was stuck. I couldn't move forward or backward. Panic flooded my mind and I struggled frantically like I couldn't breathe. After the longest minute of my life, I finally managed to maneuver my shoulders through and into my hiding spot. The hood of my coat did double duty of keeping me warm and completing my hiding place. I lowered it to the level of the asphalt and would raise it just an inch when I wanted to look out. The first half hour was the worst. The ringing in my ears had begun to subside, but I still didn't hear anything outside of my breathing. The cold slowly leaked through my clothes. Still no sign of the monster. Another hour passed. My muscles started to cramp up. Still no sign of the monster. Another hour. I felt like my bladder would burst. Still no monster. During the long boredom in between, I pulled the magazine out of the gun and counted how many bullets I had left. No matter how many times I counted, it always came out to the same number, 1. I knew one bullet wouldn't save me from the monster. There was only one thing I could do with one bullet, end my suffering if it found me. I took it out of the magazine and stared at it. I used my coat to shine it up, then stared at my reflection in the gleaming metal. The edges of the snow around the trailer began to glow. I knew the sun was coming up. Darkness was no longer my friend. I was about to give up and crawl out of my hiding place when I heard it. A soft sniffing sound. I lifted my hood an inch, just enough to peek out, and there it was. Its head had broken through the wall of snow close to where I dove under the trailer. There were a few drops of blood from my neck wound, and it was sniffing them. Those drops would lead it right to me. Sure enough, it took a turn toward the front of the trailer and looked in my direction. I lay there still as a stone as it inched its way toward me. It was having trouble squeezing its massive body under the trailer, and I could hear it growling with frustration. It came closer, crawling right toward me. There was no doubt it knew I was there. I closed my eyes and stuck the barrel of the gun under my chin. I felt its hot breath and smelled the stench of death as I squeezed the trigger. Suddenly it shrieked and I could feel the truck bucking above me. I opened my eyes to the most amazing sight. Its horns had gotten caught in the chains hanging down underneath the trailer, and it was tangled. It screamed and bucked and fought to be free from its metal captors. It yanked backward so hard I felt the truck move sideways an inch. The differential was pressing on me now, and I had to shimmy over to avoid being crushed. I watched as the chains broke away one by one, and then it was free. I took the opportunity to crawl out from under the truck. It was useless as a hiding place now. It had already tracked me here. I was almost out when I heard another sound and saw a shadow pass by the other side of the truck. It was coming back, but it was trying from the other side. I crawled as quickly as I could. This was my chance. If it searched from the other side, it might not know I had left. I had no idea where I would go, but it was better to be out of a useless hiding place. Besides, I desperately needed to stretch and pee. As I stood next to the truck, I saw a large patch of red in the snow. I guess shooting it wasn't as useless as I thought. I took care of business first, peeing before I ruined another pair of pants. I finished and thought about where to hide. I looked up at the ruined cab of my truck when the nightmare crept around the corner. I stood there helpless. It had caught me flat-footed. I had nowhere to go. It stared at me as it limped around the corner. Its empty eyes seemed to exude rage. I pulled up the gun and aimed when it disappeared in a moving mountain of snow. The snowplow had finally arrived. I watched as the plow pushed its mound of snow past my truck and over the edge of the parking lot. The driver backed up and stopped beside me. "You have been here all night," the driver said. "Since before the storm." "What happened to your truck?" he said, looking up at my shattered windows. I followed his eyes and thought for a moment. "Someone tried to rob me," I lied, knowing the truth was unbelievable. "I see you took care of it," he said, looking at the gun in my hand. I looked down at the gun and stuck it in my waistband. "It's been a hell of a night," I said. "Well, don't worry. The roads are getting cleared and I'll get you plowed out of here." "Thanks," I said. He nodded and backed up to continue plowing. I looked at where he had just plowed beside my truck and saw a long smear of red. I followed it to the edge of the parking lot and looked over the side with my hand on my gun. The drop-off was a good 10 feet or more, and the snow had already started to pile up. I followed the path of red down the hill with my eyes and saw antlers poking out of the snow. I stared at them, looking for any movement. For 10 minutes I watched, and they didn't move. I was interrupted when the plow pushed another pile of snow over the side, covering the antlers. I watched for another 5 minutes just to be sure. The plow guy pulled up beside me. "You okay?" he said. I pulled my eyes away from the snow pile. "Yeah, I'm good." "You sure?" he said, pointing at my neck. "Yeah, I just got nicked by some glass," I said, remembering the teeth of the monster clamping down on my neck. "Well, I think someone just pulled into the store," he said. "Maybe you should get something for that." "I will, thanks," I said, knowing I would do no such thing. I wanted to avoid as many questions as possible. I climbed into the cab, brushed the glass off my seat, and drove over to the fuel pumps. After filling up, I started the long trip home. I kept my cold weather gear and mask on. Having no windows or windshield made for a frigid trip. The heater was on max and aimed at my feet, keeping the bottom half of me warm. I didn't call for a tow truck because I wanted to get away from there. I never went back to that truck stop again. I didn't want to take the chance of that thing being alive. I never told anyone else about the harrowing encounter. I wish I could erase it from my mind. As I drove towards my home terminal through the endless stretch of trees, I saw one of the creatures peeking out at me that I used to think was my imagination. Now I know better. I killed a man to escape a snowstorm. The call came in the late evening. The orange in the sky had left and all the animals had burrowed away, anticipating the storm heading north. I was on the outskirts of Cadence, eating a Milky Way and watching the stars disappear behind the clouds. The cruiser's phone rang and dispatch notified me a man had wrecked on Route 16, heading south to Lilac. What happened was the storm had covered the road, which is normally empty at night. Cadence is a small town and Lilac is even smaller. The only people who drive down Route 16 are the farmers needing groceries, and they're never out that late. I figured the wreck was an outsider, somebody who didn't know the roads tend to be unsalted since the town saves money by giving that job to the sun. Dispatch told me a tow was on the way, but it would be at least an hour. The guy would feel safer with the cops there. But small towns have small forces, and it was my night on patrol. I'd have to do it. I finished my Milky Way and drove off. Minutes on the road and the white winds already rushed past the car. The dashboard said 45, but the winds made me feel like I pushed 70. I worried I would miss the wreck, that the winds might make me a new victim, but in the distance, I saw the red brakes, then the black of a sedan. I flipped my lights and parked 10 feet away, wishing I had remembered my snow hat. I didn't bother getting my clipboard, just my flashlight. Though even that felt useless against the constant white. The wreck was as I suspected, slid off the road to a nearby ditch, one lower than your average curb. Even without the ice, backing up would have been an act of God. As I approached, I nearly slipped myself, had to catch myself on nothing. The front of the sedan was caked in snow deep in the ditch, but the driver's side door was ajar. I stepped down into the ditch and pulled the door open more. The car was running, but not the heat. My flashlight revealed an empty car. I turned and looked around the street and nearby cornfields painted red and blue by the cruiser lights. Where was the man? I walked around the car and inspected the underside. Nothing. I popped the trunk. Empty. Back on the street, I looked over the car again. Something about it was off, beyond the mystery of the missing man. What it was, I couldn't put my finger on it. But, despite the clear nosedive into the snow, the sedan was clean. Almost immaculate. I took another look and realized there was no license plate, not even a temporary one. "Hello?" I asked the cold world. Only the wind replied. Back in the cruiser, I was thinking of where the man went, letting the heat blast against my face. He could have gone south, taking his chance with the storm towards Lilac. Anybody, outsider or not, would have known that was suicide though. And the cornfields nearby, maybe he ran into those, hoped he'd find a warm farmhouse. I was about to call it in and put a lookout for a guy trying to survive the snowstorm on foot when I heard it. Dog barking. It was by the wreck. And then came another sound, though I couldn't make it out inside the cruiser. Outside, the wind bared its teeth on me and howled its demand to go away. But underneath was the dogs barking, then gone. A man's voice asked, "Is everything all right?" The dog started barking again. One of the farmers must have heard the wreck and come to investigate. I started towards the wreck, telling the farmer that it was under control. Except, what was a farmer doing out in the storm? Halfway there I stopped, realized that nothing was making sense. The missing guy, an unknown car, and now this? I saw a canine shape move into view from behind the car. The dog. It hadn't stopped barking, and I worried it would come at me, that things might get dicey out here. The other officers had a running gag that out here the local dogs never liked pigs. But this one stayed put, barking, until it wasn't, and the man was asking me if everything was okay again. The question hung in the air. Something churned in my stomach. The dog resumed its barking for a few seconds, stopped, and the man asked the same question for the third time. And it hit me. The barking. The man's voice. It came from the same place. I shone my flashlight at the dog and felt the blood grip my face. It was no dog. A humanoid shape, blasted into obscurity by the winter veil, looked up at me. "Is everything all right?" It started running, crawling towards me. Before I realized what was happening, there was a gunshot, and I was standing in the snowstorm looking down at the body of a man. I held my breath as I waited for the snow to turn red, let the wind bite my nose, and frost my unblinking eyes. But the blood never ran. And what happened instead was the thing shuddered, and he started gagging. The bullet was spit out. I ran to the cruiser to drive away. There was no other option. I slammed the car door and cranked the key. The car rumbled in disagreement and wouldn't start. In my head, I was screaming with the wind, wondering how hard you need to palm slam a wheel to fuel a car with desperation. Barking interrupted my thoughts. I started to blubber to myself, all those years wanting to be a cop suddenly going out my ears, melting to the floor. A hand smacked onto the window and I screamed. I slammed the car wheel harder and turned the key enough to snap it. From outside, the thing asked me if everything was okay. I just kept screaming. The car suddenly started. Foot down. Reverse. Brake. Foot down. Going. Leaving whatever the hell that was behind. And while the snow blew past, while I tried to stop myself from blubber breathing, I wondered what had just happened. What I had wandered into. Things like that don't ever have answers, just more questions. I just started asking, why? Why? That word was on my lips when the car started to swerve, and at that moment I did everything wrong and forgot all my training in the frenzy. The cruiser flipped on its side, and I was lucky to not be crushed. I was crawling out of the window when two headlights cut through the snow right at me. The next thing I saw was a large man getting out of a truck. It was the tow. He was rushing over to me, asking me if I was okay. All I could do was mumble. He helped me to my feet and walked me over to the truck. My head was turned behind us the entire time, waiting to see that naked figure walking down the road. The inside of the truck smelled like sweat, and to this day I remember it. He was on the street, me in the truck, and he was asking me details, where I had to be that he was sent out for another, and had I been the officer they sent out. I couldn't answer him, it felt unreal. And when I looked out the windshield to the cold forever, I saw an outline and began to cough, to gag. I heard the trucker ask what the hell was going on. And then he was walking towards it. I got out, told him to stay away, and ran to him to shake his shoulders. Except I didn't. That wreck I had numbed me. So I just stood there, mouthing words and shaking my head no to the trucker's back. And then it happened. The thing was in the air, then on the trucker. And that blood that was supposed to come earlier at the gunshot, it must have just jumped through time, because a shower burst from the trucker. There was a scream, and all I saw was a cloud of red. I opened my mouth to scream, but kept coughing. In the movies, the monster realizes it's been seen, looks up from the fresh kill, and starts gibbering towards the new meat. But the thing never moved from that trucker's body, and I knew it was just going to finish eating him or God knows what else. So like a coward, I got into the truck, put my shaking hands on the wheel, hit the gas. I didn't even run over the thing, just rushed past it, not letting myself look over it. For fear, the thing would be looking at me. For fear, the trucker would be. I drove to Lilac. I fell out of the truck into the snow-covered parking lot of a Dollar General. In dreams, I still see that store, and at the counter is the trucker, his blood coursing down onto the conveyor belt. He's mouthing something I can't hear. Sometimes he's barking instead. I never look outside to the parking lot to see if the thing's out there. The next morning, I called in my resignation. When they asked why, I just hung up. A friend in the force told me that they eventually went out to search for the trucker since his wife called terrified he met an unseen fate in the storm. They never found him. I remember laughing at that news, though I couldn't tell you why. In the coming days, they tried pulling me in for a statement, answering why the guy's truck sat battery dead at a Dollar General. But I was heading south to somewhere, anywhere the snow avoided. I expected to be chased either by my old colleagues or that thing, somehow, but it never happened. Since then I've read up on what it could be and dug up the past to figure out my present. If you asked me, I still couldn't tell you what I saw. But I remember the old stories my father used to talk about, of bandits on the roads. How these bandits would stage fake accidents and take advantage of the kindness of others. How that still happened to this very day, except instead of men in cowboy hats their entire groups, a strength in numbers thing, I guess, but I'm told it's rare. At first, that explanation didn't quite fit. But the world's a strange place, and if caterpillars can look like snakes, well, maybe something watched from the shadows when people used those fake accidents, watched people get killed for being too trusting, scrounged up the looted bodies left behind. And when those old-time highwaymen stopped their trade, there was a dwindling of fresh prey. Evolution. Does it explain it? I don't know. But it's the best I've got when I look up at the night sky. I haven't had a Milky Way in years. But that doesn't make up for what I did. Maybe one day I'll go back, stand in the snowstorm by a mysterious car, and do what I should have done back then. Maybe the storm will die down and the thing's face will be revealed. And maybe I'll look into the stolen eyes of the trucker and whisper, "I'm sorry."